Sit with us. We have one hearing. It's House Bill 2620. I will open that hearing, and we will start off by having Natalie give us an explanation of the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 2620 would create the crimes of interference with the conduct of a hospital and aggravated interference with the conduct of a hospital. And it also increases the criminal penalties for battery of a healthcare provider who's employed by a hospital. Section 1 creates the new crimes. Subsection A creates the crime of unlawful interference with the conduct of a hospital, which would be conduct at or in a hospital, so as to knowingly deny any employee of the hospital the ability to enter or use the facilities of or to leave the hospital, or knowingly impeding any employee from the performance of their duties and activities through the use of restraint, abduction, coercion, or intimidation, or by force and violence or threat thereof, or also knowingly refusing to leave a hospital upon being requested to leave by the employee in charge with maintaining order if the person commits, threatens to commit, or incites others to commit any act that did or would disrupt, impair, interfere with, or obstruct the mission, processes, procedures, or functions of the hospital. Oh, thanks. Unsettling. Aggravated interference with the conduct of a hospital would be all of that activity that I described up in subsection A when the person is in the possession of any weapon. Regular interference with the conduct of a hospital would be a Class A non-person misdemeanor, and then aggravated interference with the conduct of a hospital would be a severity level 6 person felony. Section 2 amends KSA 21-5413, that's the crime of battery. It would provide that battery against a healthcare provider while that provider is engaged in the performance of their duties would be a Class A person misdemeanor. And for the purpose of that section, healthcare provider would be defined as a person who's licensed, registered, certified, or otherwise authorized by the state of Kansas to provide healthcare services in this state and is also employed by a hospital. And I can take any questions.
Do we have any questions for Natalie? Representative Hobson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Natalie. I would like to ask if not employees, but volunteers, are they covered with this law as well? People who volunteer to, whether it's to assist pushing anybody in a wheelchair, if something was to happen, are they covered by this law as well? Volunteers.
So, sure, Mr. Chairman, Representative Ohabisam. So Section 1 would cover that type of conduct because it covers a wider range of people. So if you're interfering with the conduct of a hospital in any way, then you would be covered under that new crime in Section 1. But for the battery provisions, you would have to be a person who's licensed, registered, certified, or otherwise authorized to provide healthcare services. So that would be a little bit more dependent on what the performance of those duties are.
What about those who are students who are trying to get extra credit at the hospital? Say, for instance, they're just trying to do their jobs and, somebody interferes with it, but they're students. Will this law cover them as well?
So
because technically they're not employees of the state, they're not employees of the hospital. I mean, they're just students. So how does that work out?
Right. So some of those students, it kind of depends on the profession, but some of those students do have, they may hold like a temporary license or a temporary certificate to provide healthcare services. But if they didn't, then I'm not sure. The battery provision does require that you're employed by a hospital. So I'm not sure technically that a volunteer would fall under that definition.
Yeah, I'm just concerned, like if they're trying to, not necessarily they're trying to get extra credit for a class, they will not be an employee. That's my concern. But that's all my questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, sir.
Representative Kincannon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Natalie, you did mention that they have to be an employee of the hospital. And there are physicians that are working in their own practices that are working in the hospital in that capacity. Are they covered by that?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Kincannon, my reading of the definition in the battery provision, so when we're talking about the enhanced protections for battery of those healthcare providers, you do have to be employed by a hospital as that term is defined, and I think it's KSA 465 off the top of my, or 425. So you would have to be employed by a hospital as defined in that section.
Thank you.
Representative Neely.
Is there any thing in there in regards to those that they will be dealing with that perhaps suffer from mental health or dementia or anything like that?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Neely. So for the criminal provisions, most of those standards in there are knowingly for the new crime. So short of someone being found not competent to stand trial, that would be one way that would be taken into consideration. But otherwise, you'd have to meet that knowingly culpable mental state.
Representative Wheeler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and this, I hope, is very brief, but on line 22 of the bill, and I'm going to start on 20, aggravated interference with the conduct of a hospital is interference with the conduct of a hospital as defined in subsection A when in possession of any weapon. As I'm reading that, it's not necessary that the weapon be utilized in the commission of the crime. It's just it be on your person somewhere.
I would agree with that interpretation.
And weapon under these statutes that are including daggers and dirks and throwing stars and all of those things.
Yes, yeah, I'd have to look up the specifics. I do know that throwing star is in there just because I happened to look that up, but yes.
Most hospitals post a sign about no weapons, but I don't know that it includes daggers, dirks, throwing stars, and all of those kinds of things. I just want to know if that's intentional, that all they have to do is just possess it rather than use it. And I just want to make sure I'm clear on it.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Wheeler, whether that was intentional or not would be a question for the proponents. I'm not sure what they intended with that provision, but I'm reading it the same way as you are, that you would just have to be in possession of that, not that it had to be used in the interference.
Thank you.
Representative Ralph.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Natalie, thanks. We've seen several of these things with enhancements in certain circumstances for criminal liability, and even yesterday with the sports officials. And I agree that these are things that we're needing. I like the idea of generally, I think, of this interference with an activity or an operation or such thing. I think last year we dealt with something about utility workers, or at some point we have in the last several years. Is this the first time we've kind of approached this particular generic problem from the perspective of interference with an activity or some type of an operation as opposed to specifically the individuals involved?
Mr. Chairman, Section 1 was modeled off of an existing crime, interference with the conduct of something, and I'm going to have to remember that right when I sit down. I think it's in Article 59, but so this wouldn't be the first time. I patterned it very closely off that crime. I'll let you know what it is when I sit down.
Thank you, Lanny. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any additional questions for Natalie? Check online. Okay, thank you, Natalie. We will begin with proponents, and while everyone has lots of initials after their names, Tara does not. So Tara, will let you come first. Let you go first so they don't overachieve and you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Glad to be before you without many initials behind my last name this afternoon. My name is Tara Mays, and I appear before you on behalf of our 122 members of the Kansas Hospital Association. We just want to express our most sincere appreciation for all that this committee has done over the course of the last few months, and certainly the last couple of years, to help us and our members really be able to respond to the healthcare needs of Kansans. The work that you've done has been tremendously helpful. On behalf of our members, we want to thank you. As this committee has really heard before, we are really working very hard to meet patient needs at a time when our clinical and our resources in a staff perspective are stretched very, very thin. And the truth is, when our clinical and non-clinical staff is stretched thin, that has some very real, tangible impacts to our ability to provide patient care at the levels that we've all kind of become accustomed to before we kind of went into these last couple of years. And while our industry is not unique in facing those staffing shortages and challenges, we are unique in that we cannot kick someone out of a game. We cannot kick someone out of the hospital, nor do we want to. We have both a legal and an ethical obligation to our patients and to their families to be a resource for them. And our hospitals intend to be a resource for everyone. So that does put us in a unique and challenging and sometimes, unfortunately, somewhat vulnerable situation. Violence against those serving in this field is not something that's new. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor, in the United States, injuries caused by violent attacks against medical professionals grew by 67%, starting from 2011 to 2018. Healthcare workers in our country are 5 times more likely to experience workplace violence than those in other industries. And those statistics have continued to worsen over the last few years. And we know that they go largely underreported. At KHA, we have surveyed our Kansas membership on this topic back in 2019. The survey of about 251 individuals working in hospitals around the state, mostly in critical access hospitals in small rural communities, found that 46.2% said that patients, visitors, or others have seen acts of violence committed at least 1 to 3 times per year. 21% of those said that they saw violent incidences occur 1 to 3 times per month. About 13% back in 2019 said that those were occurring 1 to 3 times per week. And while that information is helpful to us, we know that these statistics aren't all encompassing, and there's probably a lot that we're not catching and not reporting. While our hospitals have taken a lot of innovative steps that you'll probably hear about today to try to protect their employees, to assist them in preventing the escalation of instances of violence, and to help our employees recover and deal with the post-incident trauma related to these incidents. When they do occur, we know that it adds to the cost of healthcare, and it drives professionals away from this field at a very, very critical time in the state of Kansas. We've taken a different approach, as was mentioned here this afternoon. I know a lot of people have worked very hard on protecting healthcare workers, many around this table, for years, and we appreciate that. We've kind of gone back to the drawing board and said, are there ways that we need to take into account that healthcare services is a critical service and perhaps really a first responder service? So in looking at state statutes, this bill that's before you today, 2620, really is modeled after some of what we see in interference with other first responder services, things like EMS, things like fire services, and things like law enforcement. We've worked hard with the law enforcement community to say, how can we tackle this in a new and different way? So that might not look just like increasing fines, although that's a part of it, but also how do we really protect and kind of codify what's actually happening in the field, because we know that it has impacts to our ability to provide healthcare services to all patients. So today, I hope you will find useful the ability to hear directly from our hospital staff and those working on the front lines on how these instances are really impacting them, and how House Bill 2620 would help to send a very critically needed message that violence against healthcare workers is something that we take seriously in Kansas, and because we want people to stay in this particular field. With that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the opportunity to appear before you in support of House Bill 2620, and I'd be happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Tara. Committee, I'm going to wait until we're done with all the proponents, and then we'll do questions. So don't forget who you have questions for, Representative Hoheisel, and then we'll get to them. Next, I have Valerie Gleason.
Thank you, Representative Patton and members of the House Judiciary Committee for hearing my comments today on House Bill 2620. I am Valerie Gleason, Val Gleason, President and CEO of NMC Health in Newton, formerly known as Newton Medical Center. And although my most recent degrees are in business administration, I am also a registered nurse. NMC Health is the sole hospital in Harvey County, and we serve a population of approximately 85,000. As the CEO of an acute care hospital, I am concerned by workplace violence and aggression against healthcare workers on several levels, and I'd like to describe those to you today from the perspective of a CEO. My very first concern is for my employees and their well-being, both in the moment, but also afterwards, because of the known short-term and the long-term effects of being attacked at work by the people that you're trying to help. Some of my employees knew where I was going today when I left the hospital, and they waved goodbye to me and they said, "Thank you for advocating for us." Second, I'm concerned for any innocent bystanders, other patients, guests, or employees. Physical violence, harassment, intimidation, or other threatening behavior is traumatic to them too. Third, I'm concerned for my organization. Society believes and has a right to believe that hospitals should be safe havens and places that promote healing and caring. Although many would be shocked at the behaviors we've encountered for years and continue to encounter today. My own encounter as an ICU nurse in the late 1970s with a young male patient who suddenly grabbed me by my hair and uniform and would have punched me in the face if the aide hadn't stopped his fist. His reason was he said I reminded him of someone. Recently, one of my obstetrics nurses, placing a brand new baby in the infant carrier into the family's vehicle, asked where the base of the carrier was so she could snap it into place. Whereupon the father of baby removed a gun from the center console and proceeded to load it with bullets and brandished it at her while she strapped the baby into the vehicle by other means. A physician who, after a long and arduous emergency surgery, was told by the patient's son in the surgery waiting room, "If my mother dies, I'm going to kill you." An estranged male spouse who came to settle things with our employee, his wife, who already had obtained a protection from abuse order. Our hospital was forced into incident command operations mode for several hours, and the police came to assist us. As I stated in my written testimony to you, your community's hospitals have become the stop of last resort when no one else in the community can handle, especially behavioral issues in the community. We're the last resort for social service agencies, schools, other healthcare facilities, such as long-term care, and yes, even law enforcement. But make no mistake, abuse, threats, and assaults occur not only with behavioral health types of patients, they also occur with poorly behaved people, our visitors, and the patients themselves inside the ER, obstetrics, imaging, med-surg units, and even our waiting rooms. Fourth, as a CEO, I'm concerned about our own organization's liability. I recognize it's my duty and my board's duty to be concerned about providing just the right kind of safeguard for all who enter our doors. And safeguards at the right moment, trying to understand how someone might behave, a patient, a visitor. As my written testimony states, my hospital and many other hospitals in Kansas have taken many measures to mitigate risk. Many hospital CEOs probably wonder, as I do, have I done enough? Fifth concern, staffing. And Tara just spoke to that. This is a very deep concern of mine and of my colleagues who are gathered here today. Kansas faces a healthcare workforce crisis. In October of 2021, it was published widely across the United States. The average cost of RN turnover was reported as greater than $40,000 per. However, workplace violence is statistically associated with high staffing turnover rates, unplanned staff replacement costs, and costs of carrying the vacant positions and recruiting. Our ability to retain and recruit excellent staff has never been more important as our healthcare systems recover from the effects of the current pandemic. In short, as I prepared for some testimony for today, I looked to the literature. I found zero evidence that workplace violence improves staffing stability in hospitals. I deeply appreciate your committee looking at this issue in some depth today. The solution cannot continue to be one-sided where the victim, and speaking as a CEO, I'm saying in my case, our corporation, our staff as one, shoulders the risk, the outcome, and the blame for workplace violence by society. This House Bill 2620 demonstrates society joining hands with us as a gesture of support for the job that you want us to do with our excellent clinicians. This bill is an encouragement to me. It says to healthcare workers, you matter. And that the fact you're a hospital worker doesn't mean you should have to be afraid to show up and do your job. I view this bill as a protective regulation that, when coupled with all the Kansas hospitals' violence prevention programs and security investments, could change the stories you will hear today from my colleagues. So I want to thank you, Mr. Patton, and the committee for hearing us. And I ask for your support of HB 2620. And like Tara, I would be happy to stand for questions at any time.
Thank you. Next, we have Stephanie Wise.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, good afternoon. My name is Stephanie Wise, and I'm the Chief Nursing Officer at Advent Health Shawnee Mission. Also with me today, my colleagues from Advent Health, Rebecca Wall and Molly Hayes. Thank you for allowing me to appear in support of House Bill 2620. We've been proud to extend our healing mission since 1962. As the largest provider of healthcare in Johnson County, we have 504 licensed hospital beds on our Shawnee Mission campus and employ over 1,300 nurses and 3,000 employees. We have the highest nursing recognition achievement magnet status. We serve the greater Kansas City, we're honored to serve the greater Kansas City metro and beyond, and 80% of our patients come from Johnson and Wyandotte counties. As you've heard, we're in a healthcare staffing crisis right now. We have more than 400 open positions, and it's critical that we explore initiatives that not only create a pipeline to healthcare, but attract healthcare professionals to the state of Kansas, but also retain the current workforce that we have today. We need to protect them. Violence in hospitals is a contributing factor to stress and burnout for nurses and all employees in the hospital. As a nurse, I started my career in the emergency department in 2008. I also served as a director of an emergency department as well. And I, too, am part of those statistics that you just heard. I've been a victim of workplace violence. My most impactful story, although doesn't compare with a gun being waved in my face, was during a night shift, and I was caring for a patient that became erratic in behavior, jumped out of the stretcher, pushed me aside, pulled out the IV, blood running, dripping down the hallway. I finally caught up with the patient at the EMS doors. She subsequently turned around and slapped me in the face with a bloody hand. It was horrifying. I went home and I cried. I woke up questioning my choice of career. I'm still here, but many are not. After much investment in our education, we can't afford stories like that to impact people leaving our workforce. We need every single nurse, every single hospital employee that we can retain. We can't afford it. Keep in mind that violence in hospitals affects beyond nursing. It affects physicians, it affects respiratory therapists, laboratory technicians, ancillary support services, anyone that touches our patients. Unlike professionals, as you've heard, unlike professionals or other places of business, federal law requires us, and we want to, see every patient that enters our doors. We can't turn anyone away, and we don't want to. We're there to serve the community. But acts of violence, such as you just heard, interfere with our ability to care for our community and deliver these critical services. We're committed to supporting our team members and providing them with the resources that they need to give the highest quality of care. We invest heavily in policies and training and education so that they can identify when behaviors are escalating and stop them in the moment and know how to respond when they do happen. Our clinical teams wear radio transmitted locator systems. It's a personal panic device that notifies security of their exact location. Security responds in 3 minutes. Sometimes 3 minutes is too long. Specifically, I have seen our team members victims of punching, kicking, choking, biting, headbutting, spitting, forceful grabbing, and sometimes they've suffered concussions as a result or worse. Our Hospital Safety and Security Committee carefully tracks these incidents. We put procedures and policies into place to prevent them. Additionally, Advent Health is very proud to provide our team members with free confidential counseling as a way to mitigate the mental effects of a violent act. We know violence is not going to go away with this legislation. We can't eliminate crime, but we can increase awareness, communication, and accountability by increasing penalties, which is why we support House Bill 2620. Without more accountability through the legal system, it sends a message that we don't matter, that our healthcare teams don't matter. Our team members are reluctant to press charges or to report at this point for a variety of reasons. One reason we've heard, I don't know why you're reporting, nothing will happen. Or it's just a part of the job. I'm here today to tell you it's not part of the job, and we can't tolerate it. This is a national problem, and many states have acted, and we hope Kansas will consider doing the same, supporting our healthcare workers and not tolerating violence. As a nurse, first and foremost, and Chief Nursing Officer, I'm grateful to participate in today's hearing. Thank you for all of your work, Mr. Chairman and Committee. Thank you for listening, and I will stand for questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you. Morgan Gerhart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On behalf of Stormont Vale and my coworkers in the Emergency Department, we thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony today in support of House Bill 2620. My name is Morgan Gerhart. I'm the Director of the Emergency Department at Stormont Vale, and I've worked there for 15 years. But most importantly, I'm a nurse. And you should know that, similarly, there are two beliefs in my emergency department. And the first is that being kicked, punched, bitten, or threatened is just part of the job. And the second is that if it does happen, why report? Nothing will come of it. The mental toughness that is required for nurses to be kicked, punched, bitten, threatened, to just minutes later have to critically think and save the lives of the next patient is unlike that of any other profession, and certainly not sustainable. And while we may not eliminate fear, we can offer healthcare workers security in that those who act violently will be held accountable for their actions. Physical abuse is not part of the job, and reporting will and should create a safer environment for our healthcare workers. So while I stand here today for all healthcare workers, my heart is here to share the testimony of my friend Jamie Potter. Jamie was a nurse in our emergency department. And in 2016, she took over for a 30-week pregnant nurse at triage. She asked the patient who was next what he was here for and what he presented for, just like we do every other patient. And there was a 2-hour wait that day, so she had to ask some additional questions. The patient stood up, stated he had been seen elsewhere, and that he was there looking for better care. And then unprovoked, he stood up and quickly began striking Jamie in the head with a closed fist. She remembers screaming no, covering her face. She remembers falling backwards and out of her chair, striking her head on the floor. Her arm was caught behind her as she tried to brace her fall. She was trapped in that small room. The patient was on top of her and continued to repeatedly strike her. Unfortunately, a paramedic finally was able to get to her and free her from that patient. She was able to run quickly and get to safety and be surrounded by her peers. She recalls the next 16 hours as a blur. She was admitted for observation for a concussion, and she required medication to help calm her nerves. The following day, Jamie was discharged and went home to her husband and 3 small children, the youngest of whom she was still breastfeeding. Jamie called the DA's office that next day to ask them what her options were, and she was quickly notified that the patient had been let go with a misdemeanor. She was in shock. She felt anger. She felt betrayal. And she had to ask herself how it could be that he was released from jail before she had been released from the hospital. Jamie didn't just suffer a concussion. She later required surgery to that shoulder that was pinned behind her. And Jamie was an athlete, and she was known for her mental and physical toughness. And the physical recovery would be easy for her, but the mental recovery was not. 2 days following the attack, Jamie's milk supply dried up, and she was no longer able to breastfeed her child. She was warned that it would happen, but she wasn't prepared for it. The shoulder surgery had left her unable to pick up her daughter for weeks, and her husband had to take time off of work to help care for their children. She recalls, the nightmares and visions started immediately. I would see his face and remember everything about that attack. I couldn't sleep without medications, and if I woke up, there was no going back to sleep. I would overreact to the slightest thing. My middle child was 2 at the time, and I feel like he was who I hurt the most. I overreacted to him. For some reason, he ignited me. The way he cried, how he responded, and how I responded back to him. I couldn't control my emotions. My relationship with my husband changed, and it was pointed out to me later by one of my many therapy sessions that I separated myself from my friends and my coworkers as a way of surviving. What happened to Jamie that day in 30 seconds didn't just happen to Jamie. It happened to the patient care technician who watched it all unfold, who jumped on his back but couldn't make it stop. It happened to the paramedic who risked himself and putting himself in danger to stop that attack. It happened to the security guards who felt guilty they didn't get there in time. It happened to the male charge nurses who melted into a pile of tears because they couldn't save her soon enough. It happened to the 30 weeks pregnant nurse who couldn't help but think that could have been me. It happened to every one of us that day, and it changed everything, but not enough. Jamie's attack happened 6 years ago, but violence is continuing to happen every day in our healthcare setting. On Monday, a patient safety monitor was attacked while sitting with the patient. On Friday, a patient presented to the hospital with a loaded gun, and he left angry, threatening to use it. Fortunately, it had been secured by our security guards on arrival. And on Saturday, after a patient urinated on a computer, he then struck 3 different nurses. It's time that we stand up to protect our healthcare workers, to protect the Jamies in our hospitals, and to ensure that all healthcare workers who have been bitten, punched, kicked, and attacked while they were trying to give the best care to help another human being will know that these people causing harm in the very place of caring will be held accountable and face consequences for their actions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Committee members.
Juliana Reescheck. Did I get that halfway right? Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Chairman Patton, members of the Judiciary Committee. My name is Juliana Reescheck, and I'm here to present in support of House Bill 2620. I am the Vice President of Nursing at Ascension Via Christi St. Francis campus in Wichita, Kansas. Ascension Via Christi has served the state of Kansas and its residents for over 130 years. We are the largest healthcare provider in the Wichita area and in central Kansas. During my 18 years as a nursing leader, I have seen a staggering increase in the number of violent acts towards our healthcare workers. Recently, the American Nurses Association published a study where they said 1 in 4 nurses will experience a violent event, as you've heard my colleagues describe, throughout their nursing career. With the current laws that are in place, it becomes an individual's decision as to whether to call and press charges or not. Many times when our nursing staff call law enforcement to press charges after one of these events, as you've heard others say, we hear the same thing. Are you sure you really want to go through this work? Nothing's going to come of it. Or, you signed up for this when you went to nursing school. And I can assure you, I did not sign up to be the victim of a violent event when I went to nursing school. As a healthcare organization, Ascension Via Christi serves a large number of behavioral health patients. And many of these patients have sought care and been denied at other organizations. Sometimes we even hear from Osawatomie or Larned that they are too violent or too complex to be cared for in those organizations. So they come to Ascension Via Christi, and we take care of them, and we're glad to. As a private organization, we're regulated by CMS, and CMS standards require us to see all patients, even those that are denied at Osawatomie and Larned. One of our psychiatrists recently shared with me a cycle that we have seen over and over and over again many times. An individual may be living a healthy life in the community. They may have a mental illness, but they are well balanced and living a healthy life. And they start to have thoughts about these medications that I take are expensive. It's burdensome to make a trip to the pharmacy on a regular basis. And so then they think, well, I really don't need these. I'm doing very well. So they stop taking those medications. They start experiencing symptoms of their mental illness. Sometimes those symptoms are aggressive behaviors and violent acts, as you've heard described here by my colleagues. And so what happens is they end up back at the hospital. And those violent attacks become targeted towards our healthcare workers. We spend a lot of time and complex cares and treatments, and we work with those patients to stabilize them and get them back into a healthy state. And then they're discharged home. But because charges were not filed, not pressed, there's no accountability. There's no ramifications for those behaviors. And when patients are in a healthy state, many times they forget what those actions were, those thoughts were, those symptoms were that they experienced when they were not in a healthy state. And so begins the cycle again. Why do I need these medications? I'm really just fine. So in conclusion, I'd like to ask for your support for House Bill 2620. I think it will show the support to our healthcare workers who have dedicated their lives to taking care of us as the residents of Kansas. Thank you, Chairman Patton. I'll stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you. Next, we have John Brady, and John is on WebEx.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having me here to present on House Bill 2620. My name is John Brady, and I am the Director of Security for St. Luke's Health System, and I represent over 12,000 employees. We have approximately 8 hospitals in the state of Kansas, but more than that, I'm also a board member on the Midwest Security Association. This collaborative is a working group of professionals across multiple states that represent security. We work together to share ideas and improve hospital safety and security, and we also discuss workplace violence events, especially intentional assaults, on a regular basis. Regardless of location, names, dates, and times, the stories are very similar. Often, it is a patient does not get what they want, so they will intentionally respond with grabs, slaps, hits, attacks, or even throw bodily fluids. I know when we think of intention and mental culpability, it's hard to imagine that with somebody with sound mind would attack another person with bodily fluids, but I've seen it firsthand. We had a patient present for care and was being discharged, and they didn't get what they wanted at the time. So they went into the restroom, defecated into a trash bag, and came out and said, "Are you going to give me what I want? If not, I'm going to explode this bag." The care provider backed up, and he said it's too late, and he smashed the contents on the ground, which splattered across the ER room, causing a significant disruption in care. These acts occur daily across the state of Kansas. Often the police are called, and these culprits often operate in areas where they know that they can have the greatest opportunity of getting away with their bad and illegal behaviors. Often they do things where individuals have to sign as a complainant. Many times care providers or nurses do not pursue charges for many reasons, as my cohorts have mentioned, from fear, intimidation. Intimidation, you may think, well, how does that occur when somebody comes to the hospital, this event occurs, and they leave? As others have spoken to, we can't deny care when people come to our EDs. Often the same person who committed an act yesterday will return the next day, and if it's the same care team working, they will see that patient again and provide them the best care possible. Oftentimes, people will intimidate by making comments like, "Oh, I researched you on social media," and this adds to fear and really kind of interferes with the care that can be provided. And thirdly, another common reason is time. As you are aware, these events occur on a regular basis, and team members know if they go to court, it will take time, and other coworkers will have to cover those shifts. But also, it takes time away from that person providing care to individuals who they know would come to the hospital. These care providers want to help people and make them feel better, make them feel well, help them heal. And they don't want to take time away from doing that. This bill would clearly allow organizations to pursue charges and take that burden off of our frontline staff as an organization. Really, in many situations, security responds and witnesses these disruptions. Their testimony, along with that of or evidence such as video, would be able to pursue a solid charge against these individuals. This would allow care providers to provide care to the individuals whom they hope to help. This will allow hospitals to protect all and improve care across the state of Kansas. My statement's brief, but I'm also available for questions should you have them.
Very good. Thank you. Next, we have Ed Klump.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee members. My name is Ed Klump. I'm here on behalf of the Kansas Association, Chiefs of Police, Kansas Sheriff's Association, and the Kansas Peace Officers Association. This is a endeavor that our associations have been working on with the Kansas Hospital Association and others for probably 5 or 6 years now. Some of you that have been around a while may recall we've been up here with a bill similar to this before. The first attempts were to try to make it a felony, similar to what it is for a law enforcement officer for certain levels of battery to a healthcare worker. That was met with resistance because of bed space impact, putting a label of a felon on a person, and other reasons that we shouldn't do that. So Representative Ralph, you ask a very good question. What about the referees and the sports officials and the others that come in? And I'd like to talk a little bit about that. Why are healthcare workers different? And you look at what we've done for statutes that specifically address interference with a law enforcement officer, interference with the judicial system, interference with firefighters, interference with an emergency medical services worker, in other words, the EMTs, EMSs out in the field. And we made those laws, we requested those laws because when these batteries happen and when this interference happens, it affects the ability to provide critical services to certain people. It prevents a law enforcement officer from taking actions that they otherwise should be taking to apprehend a criminal or helping a victim. It prevents a firefighter from putting out a fire or from administering first aid as a first responder. It prevents an EMS worker from doing that. What we have here is a very similar situation. The difference between a healthcare worker and, say, sports officials, and I'm not just picking on them because you get a variety of people coming up here with these requests. But the difference is the same as it is with firefighters, law enforcement, and EMS. When these events happen, it disrupts the entire capability of that healthcare unit to provide healthcare to patients. It jeopardizes the health and safety of other people because they have to be distracted because they're being beaten on or because somebody's threatening them and they can't give care because they've got to give their attention to their own safety. Now, I can tell you, we have a very close relationship, especially with emergency room medical personnel, because we deal with them a lot. Sometimes we deal with them because we take the people in that's been described to you. Sometimes we deal with them a lot because we go in to talk to victims that are there getting treatment. Unfortunately, sometimes we go there. I don't know, you can't talk to very many law enforcement officers that had a career in law enforcement that haven't been there getting treatment. So we got a very special relationship with them and we understand what they have. Another thing is, as a law enforcement officer, one of the things we are constantly watching for is what we call weapons of opportunity. You talk about an environment rich with weapons of opportunity. Go into an emergency room, go into a medical facility. All the IV stands and the electronic equipment that can be picked up and thrown and things like that. It's just an environment rich with those problems. So in my work with the Kansas Hospital Association, our associations kind of put together a package of information that could be used by the medical industry to meet with and discuss these issues with local law enforcement, with local prosecutors, because you heard the problem we have with prosecutors. So I personally have given probably 6 to 8 presentations at medical conferences and things like that about what do we do? What do we do when we get assaulted? How do we get, our reports made? How do we get action? How do we get the prosecutors to understand why it's important we prosecute these cases? So that's kind of a history of how we got to where we're at. So one of the things that this bill does is create that new crime of interference with a healthcare worker. And that language comes almost identically from 21-5922. That statute has to do with interference with the conduct of public business in public buildings. Those are buildings that are owned and operated by state, city, county, local governments. That's not public because the public has access to them. It's not your Walmart. It's not your Dillon store. It's not your hospitals unless they're publicly operated. And so we looked at this and said, why shouldn't these healthcare workers have at least the same level of protection that you all have in this building to protect against the public's business being conducted in this building? When in addition, with the healthcare workers, they're interfering with care that may be needed for your child, your wife, your family member, your neighbor. That's why enhancement for this group of workers is important. And I think it's justified. And I hope you will agree with that too. So let's talk about the battery charge. And as a group, I think they've kind of given up on making it a felony. And quite frankly, I think that's a good move. Why do I think that's a good move? We went for a battery is a B misdemeanor. If you were to walk out here today and somebody would smack you in the nose, that's a B misdemeanor. And we're asking for this to be made an A misdemeanor, one level higher. Sadly, that's probably better than making it a felony because it would be a low-level felony. It would be a mandatory probation. They would never see any jail time, even if the judge thought it was so grievous that they thought they should. We tag them with a felony. Now they creates all the other problems that we've been talking about in other meetings. And so the A misdemeanor really can carry more of an impact aimed at the conduct in a specific case than we're able to do with a felony. It's a sad state of affairs, but that's where we're at. Many of you heard me talk probably about, I think there needs to be a third level of crime. We need to call it a felony. It's not serious enough to be a felony. It's too serious to be a misdemeanor. And that's what a lot of our low-level felonies are. And it's kind of sad because when I started in my law enforcement career, if you were a felon, you were a bad dude. There was no two ways about it. You were a bad dude. And now, maybe you drove too many times on your suspended driver's license. So I tell you this because I just can't tell you passionately enough how important I think this is for this class of worker to have the benefit of this increase in penalty for these batteries. And let's add this interference that is equivalent to the protection that we give to every public building owned by the government in this state. I don't think that's asking too much. And I'll answer one other thing that was brought up about the firearm. That is the exact language out of 2159-22. That's why it's here. It's consistent with what's in 2159-22. I think we need an aggravated version of this. That's a policy decision, whether it's possession or whether it's use or is it display or whatever it is. But a person with a weapon on them that's conducting themselves like this is that far away from using that weapon that they might have never done. And it's something to consider. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I feel like I kind of got on a soapbox here, but I feel very passionate about this because I've worked with these groups. I think some of these people have testified alongside me before on this. And I just think it's time we do this. It's time we do something to help these people that are facing these attacks in their workplace. Thank you very much. I'll stand for questions when it's appropriate.
Thanks, Ed. Next, Kelly Summers, and Kelly is online.
Chairman Patton and committee, thank you so much for allowing me to be here today to speak on behalf of Kansas State Nurses Association. I'm the director and I am also a BSN RN, and our members are also constituent members of the American Nurses Association, or ANA. And this is a conversation that we have been having for years at the national level regarding workplace violence. And it just systemically is becoming a larger issue. And I would say probably part of that is due to COVID too, as we're seeing more hospitalizations and less staff right now too. And we look to this bill as a stepping stone, so to speak, on how we can move forward to helping with those staffing issues. There are many reasons for staffing issues, but this is one. And I talk to our members daily on a daily basis, and they share stories like this with me. And it is hard to hear the stories just like those who were shared with you today. It is incredible what our nurses are experiencing right now, and on top of violence too, that has always existed and now has become magnified. So I appreciate that this bill was put forward. And we all, it's interesting because when you look at nursing, you don't think of it necessarily as an area where you would be battered and beaten. However, you see this more in a hospital than you'll ever see with a police officer and that you will ever see with a security guard in a prison. And 14% of nurses, the reason why they'd have to take off a day or two is because of workplace violence. So they're using their own time to take care of themselves. And right now, the concern really is that we're so short-staffed. We have nurses just completely overworked right now. And then you have the violence committed against them too. So it's not only losing that, but we want to be there to provide care. And it puts us in a situation actually where we're in more risk for causing an error to happen. And that is something that we need to discuss, because it's not only staffing, it's not only safety, it's causing errors, and that puts their license at risk, a license that they worked very, very hard to obtain, and they have continued to work to keep up that license too. So I think what we need to be looking at is this is a stepping stone. I would like to be able to see it expand some outside of the hospital system, because I do hear stories from nurses in many different areas. I myself have experienced abuse on many different levels in doing home visits and in psychiatric hospitals too. So I'm just here today to really ask you to look at this, to ask the questions that you need to ask from those of us who are here today, so that we can share our information and our experiences. And, you know, I do appreciate, because this is brought up a lot about the mental health and dementia piece of it, so I always want to make sure I address it. It was a conversation that I had last June, because again, we're always talking about workplace violence on the national level. So I was speaking to our representatives and senators there about it. And that is the one reason why people are fearful to pass this bill. And so I understand why that's being brought up. However, it's really the point that we could have a person removed from the situation at the time too, for their safety and for our safety. So it's both. So it's not wanting to penalize somebody that suffers from a severe condition, but actually removing from that situation at the time, which is the best way to handle it. And additionally, another piece that was brought up that was a concern of mine too, because I would love to be able to address this in this bill, is how we could incorporate students into this, because we have a shortage of nurses. Nurses are coming in to the workforce and they don't expect what's going to happen. You can have all the training in the world, but once you're in that situation, it's hard to remember it. And those students do need to be protected, because we need our future nurses. So thank you for bringing up those 2 points, everyone, because I actually had it in my notes to address. And I'll be here for questions at the appropriate time. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Next, John McMaster.
My name is John McMaster, and I'm an emergency physician here in the state of Kansas, and I'm here testifying on behalf of all of these people that you already heard from, which are my team members. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Representative Chairman Patton and the distinguished members of this committee for listening to this. I appreciate this opportunity to address you in the support of this legislation. As a practicing emergency physician in the state of Kansas since 1985, I am again today, for the third time, offering written and verbal testimony as to in need of support of this legislation. It is long overdue. Unfortunately, our hospital-based emergency departments are becoming overcrowded as we and my medical colleagues from all specialties, not just emergency medicine, are attempting to address all of society's ills. For better or for worse, the practice of emergency medicine, as well as providing emergency healthcare services to the citizens of our state, as well as the nation, has become a much more dangerous vocation than when I first entered into this business in 1982. It is not uncommon for me to work a shift in any of my hospital-based emergency departments without hearing of or having personal knowledge of a patient or a patient's family member intimidating, threatening, assaulting, or causing physical injury or harm to any one of my team members. This includes pre-hospital providers, as you have heard. This includes the nursing personnel, technicians, reception personnel, guards, as well as physicians. This unchecked behavior continues to escalate within all aspects of our society and communities, and the hospital emergency departments are no exception. Unfortunately, working today in any of the nation's hospital-based emergency departments has become a much more dangerous vocation, as you have heard, than when I first started practicing, and interestingly has worsened since I first testified before this body on this same issue in 2014. Today, our emergency health care providers, which many have been identified recently as heroes, are not unlike many public servants just like you and law enforcement personnel who enter their professions of service to protect the public and prevent harm to patients, family, and the communities in which we live. Unfortunately, the current statutory protections afforded these healthcare heroes has not been elevated to the same level of protection afforded other public servants. This legislation attempts to rectify that deficiency. House Bill 2620 provides increased statutory protections to those healthcare providers who, in the line of performing their professional duties, are physically assaulted or intentionally harmed. Emergency care for our citizens needs to be as safe as boarding an airline for travel or appearing in a judicial courtroom. We owe it to the healthcare team, the institutions which we work, and the patients and publics that we serve to protect our ability to practice our vocation without the fear of suffering from assaults or bodily injury. Real-time examples experienced during my career include the following, and they are included in your written testimony. One includes an orthopedic resident that was assaulted by a psychotic patient that he attempted to obtain a history from. An emergency physician, a colleague of mine at one of the institutions that Juliana referred to, was attempting to provide definitive airway and an endotracheal intubation of an intoxicated patient, and he had his finger bitten by that person and had to be amputated. During my career, I personally have had my life and physical well-being threatened by patients and patient family members for refusing to provide prescription narcotics. I've experienced countless examples of nurses that I've worked with who have been intentionally spit upon, scratched, bitten, punched, while trying to render emergency care to the patients we are destined to take care of. Just in the last few years, a very experienced nurse practitioner that I've had the privilege of working with for decades was assaulted by a patient and suffered a hip fracture while on duty in the emergency department. It is not uncommon that I have experienced hospital security personnel who have sustained broken bones while trying to protect the other people in the emergency department. And I urge you to read the written testimony presented by one of my colleagues, Dr. Joshua Davis, who just within the last several months was physically assaulted by a patient and the patient's family in the emergency department while trying to render emergency care. He couldn't be here today because he, like I, dedicated our lives to doing this, and he had to work a shift. This unchecked behavior continues to escalate within all aspects of our society and communities. Our hospital emergency departments are no exception. House Bill 2620 provides increased statutory protections to those healthcare providers who, in the line of performing their professional duties, are physically assaulted or harmed. We owe it to the healthcare providers, the institutions within which we work, the patients and the public that we serve to protect our ability to practice our vocation without the fear of suffering from assaults, physical harm, or bodily injury. And with that, I conclude and will be glad to answer questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you. Morgan Stebbins.
Chairman Patton, committee members, I am a frontline worker. I am an ER nurse. I am a forensic nurse. I've dedicated my life to taking care of patients, and I thank you for hearing me today. As you've heard, this problem is not a problem that is new. It is old, and essentially it was a pandemic before the pandemic. It's a problem across the nation. You've heard several people talk about how they have had trauma themselves. This happens every single day. In my written testimony, I asked you to think about being in the hospital yourself or with a loved one. And I'm sitting there helping you. I'm trying to take care of you. I'm getting you started. And all of a sudden we hear somebody yelling and screaming. And I have to leave you in order to go make sure that my colleagues are safe to take care of other patients. That is not something that I pulled out of thin air. This happens every single day in healthcare institutions across the nation. So this problem has become part of healthcare culture, and it's time for that culture to change. These people come into the hospitals and healthcare institutions, they have this behavior, they perform as they want to perform, and we try to get charges pressed against them. We say, this is what I want to do. And we're told, why? It's not going to go anywhere. So essentially, they're slapped on the wrist and they come back to do it again. Their behavior is not addressed, so they say, why not? This is how I'm going to behave. I'm going to continue to behave like this because it's not a problem. It's a toxic culture, and we need a culture change. Institutions are taking steps to overcome an unacceptable toxic culture. My first experience with assault in the ER was when I was a brand new nurse. I put a patient in a hallway, got her a glass of water. She was mad that she was sitting in the hallway and threw that water in my face. I was just trying to take care of her. 2 shifts this week, I experienced violence. One of the patients lunged at me because she couldn't have her cell phone because she was a harm to herself and other people, and that's a policy and protocol we were trying to follow. So she lunged at me because she wasn't getting what she wanted. Another patient came in, was having a psychotic break, and he was lunging at staff in the room as well. I was also one of the nurses taking care of him. This was in the last week. This happens on a daily basis. Things like CPI, crisis prevention, intervention, is taught so that we can prepare ourselves to defend ourselves against violence. We have to prepare our staff to defend themselves because we know that patients are going to be violent. Healthcare institutions are taking steps so that we create a zero-tolerance violence environment, but now it's your turn to give us the basis to follow through with that. And this legislation would assist those institutions in creating an environment where we can say, you're going to have charges pressed against you, and we are not going to put up with this anymore. We will see a change. We will see staffing increase. People do not want to come to work to be abused, and we don't deserve it. Don't our named healthcare heroes deserve to come to work in a safe environment to take care of you and your loved ones? Thank you for hearing my testimony, and I will take questions when appropriate.
Very good, thank you. Committee, I have written proponent testimony from the Kansas County and District Attorneys Association, from Catherine Hay, from Dr. Joshua Davis, from the Kansas Emergency Nurses Association, and from Datha Wilson. Anyone else here? She is present. Datha, come on up. There you are.
I'd like to first thank you guys for inviting me to come to speak today, and also as well as taking this bill into account to help protect us on the front lines. I'm an ER nurse, and I have been in the nursing field for 14 years now. I currently work at St. Francis ER in Wichita, Kansas, and I prior worked at St. Joe for multiple years, which is known as a mental health kind of hub in the community. With that, my thing is we need to increase protection against the medical, my colleagues and my peers. Many of them, as stated, are leaving the nursing field as a whole, and also causing an increased risk for us that are left behind. My presence here today is for the peers amongst me that can't be here, and in the midst of a pandemic we are currently dealing with multiple situations arising where we are short-staffed and we no longer have help and care in these kind of violent situations. I have myself personally dealt with having to call a trauma alert on my other nurse that was injured on the job. She went to a room to give a patient Haldol that had been in a prior standoff, and she was punched in the face for no reason at all. She then was taken to an ER room where she ended up having a nasal fracture and then started seizing. She was then transferred to St. Francis as a trauma and remained hospitalized for multiple days, where she was away from her family and was unable to return to work. She is one of the stories, and one of the many, that now it's almost a norm, that it is okay for them to assault us and injure us. As we sit there, we come to render aid to anyone. It doesn't matter if it is a victim or if it's a person that has done harm to others. We're there without guns, without weapons, providing care for these patients. Our thing is we just need assistance from the state and helping us, backing us for statutes and legislation so that we have a leg to stand on. I've even attached into my testimony as well weapons and things that I can say that us nurses and security have taken off prior to law enforcement involvement. That many times before anyone is there to help, that we ourselves have to take off drug paraphernalia, guns, and knives from people that come in to receive care. I know that Representative Concanon came down on a Monday to St. Joe and personally saw how the extent of the situation and how the medical staff and things are treated on the front lines. I feel like post-pandemic, we are still continuing to see this, and we're continuing to see it even at higher waves. I will allow questions when you time. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else here as a proponent? Come on up.
Thank you, Chairman Patton. I actually did provide testimony. I'm not sure if it didn't make it through or not. But thank you guys for allowing me to come speak. My name is Sarah Evans Simpson. I'm an emergency room nurse, and I've been an emergency room nurse for 15 years and a forensic nurse for 11 years. I have seen throughout my career multiple people of my coworkers assaulted in the emergency department. And we don't report because it's too much of a hassle, and you've heard that from multiple people. But on May 2nd, 2019, I became that coworker. I was actually helping out. I had a technician who was sitting with a patient who was aggressive, and the technician was so upset after the way that he was being treated by the patient that he needed time to step away and maybe switch out with somebody. So I volunteered to go sit with the patient while he figured out what was going on. Multiple times she came at me. I was able to block her. I was able to tell her that we weren't going to tolerate her behavior. And as other staff members entered the room, my eyes were off of her, and I was not able to pay attention to her, and she attacked me. She hit me in the face so hard that it broke my glasses, and I was so stunned by what had happened, it took me a moment to figure it all out. But because of staffing, which you've already heard about, I had to continue the rest of my 4-hour shift after this trauma with no glasses and a head injury. The next 3 months were some of the worst months of my life. I was off work for 3 months due to the concussion that I sustained. I was told because of the concussion, I had to be in a dark room. I was not allowed to watch TV, be on my phone, my computer. I was in the midst of a master's program at the time. I have a young child and a family to take care of, but I couldn't sit up long enough because I was dizzy and it hurt. As I was going back to work, I learned that the DA dropped my case. The pandemic is making all this worse, as you've already heard from multiple people, because our wait times are longer, people are not allowed to be with their family members when they want to be, and the violence is increasing. We go into healthcare to help people, and we leave a battered and torn shell of ourselves because of the years of abuse and trauma that we have sustained. It's not just physical, but mental trauma also. I now currently work at an office position in the emergency department. And I come to work every day and I ask myself, how and why do these people come to work every single day? And I know that it's the same reasons that I came to work every single day. I loved my job and I love my coworkers. My coworkers were my family. I stand here today asking that you guys consider House Bill 2620 because I don't want my family members and my coworkers to be abused any longer. And I do believe that House Bill 2620 will alleviate some of this situation because if people know that there are consequences, they'll be less likely to harm us. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you. Anyone else as a proponent? Okay. I don't have anyone listed as a neutral or an opponent. Do we have any of those here today? Okay, we'll close the hearing on House Bill 2620. Oh yeah, I'm not closing the hearing. We've got questions. Questions committee. I really don't want questions, but we'll do them. Representative Owens.
Well, then this ought to make you pretty happy. Thank you, Chairman Patton. And I've got to stand here, or sit here for now, and say how thankful I am that the CEO of my hospital, Val Gleason, came up here. I have had the opportunity to watch her work and to watch her leadership in our community, and truly see the remarkable work she does. But the one thing I know about Val is that she would pass the buck to her staff and to everyone around her. She would look at the people around her and thank them for their work. As I sit here and I look around the room, Mr. Chairman, if it would be appropriate, I think I would like to give a round of applause to these fine folks and these healthcare workers, these frontline workers who have given so much to us over the last 2 years. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Kincannon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question's for Dr. McMaster. It's pretty simple.
Simple questions.
Dr. McMaster helped train my husband, so I've got.
And an excellent physician he is.
We have a long history. But are you employed by the hospital?
I am not employed by Ascension Via Christi. In 2015, as an employed physician, our contract was given to a contract management group stationed in California by the name of Vituity.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask another one? Just real quick. Okay.
Yeah,
I'll wait.
yes.
I'll-
No, I'm kidding. Go. You're fine,
You're
Representative
so
Kincannon.
mean to me. It's not for you. I'm done. I'm done with you, Doc. Tara. So I'm signed on as a co-sponsor of this, but I had no idea that the physicians were not included in this, that are not employees. And it was not my impression. Was that the intent?
That was not the intent. We would love to have them included in the bill.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Schreiber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all again for being here. The question I have actually originated with Ms. Stebbins' testimony, but if anybody would want to stand up, that's fine. Are Are many of these repeat offenders? I think you used a term, Ms. Devens, that of repeat offenders. Is that common, or you see them once and they move on to another hospital or something?
There are repeat offenders, yes. There are people who come in on a regular basis and engage in this behavior. But there are also not repeat offenders, and we see a variety of patients who engage in violent behavior.
Representative Neely.
Tara, was any consideration given to any of the other facilities that nurses regard, whether it be elder care facilities, et cetera? I worked in some of these facilities. I know that they deal with the same situations that you guys deal with. I've seen the things that you guys have seen, and I think that this could be expanded further.
Yeah, really good question. Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman and Representative. When we sort of initially looked at this, we wanted to get at where we're probably seeing large amounts of violence. And we talked about whether we should take a more expansive approach or a more limited approach. And as I think we've heard here today, we were trying to be really limited in our approach and cognizant of the fact that this bill has been before you in many forms. So starting with a limited approach was really what we were looking at in terms of facilities.
Representative Kincannon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, I actually just have a comment, and I'm gonna have to pay for having a comment. I'm gonna have to pay for my phone going off yesterday. So I had a busy day, so you didn't get your treats, but they will come. No, I just want to say that you've heard reference. I don't know of very many of you who were here in 2015 when I worked on this bill before, but it was before Judiciary. And I did go down and shadow Datha Wilson at the hospital in Wichita, and was able to observe quite a few things myself. And it was quite a bit. It was different then because Osawatomie and Larned were, we had waiting lists a mile long. And so that's different, but it's worse now with COVID. And it's not just the cities, that's who's represented here, but this is in our critical access hospitals as well. I contacted the emergency room in Beloit, and it's at least every week. I mean, if not every day. But I would caution you on, Tara did talk about this being limited. What doomed this bill before was expanding it. And I just want to say this now before the opportunity, if hopefully we have the opportunity to work the bill, people will come to you and want to add on to this. They will find out that this bill is getting worked, and they will see it as an opportunity and a good opportunity. I don't want to deny that. But this bill was kicked out of Judiciary and went to the House floor. And when they added the dog catcher, then somebody made the motion to send it back. And I'm not even kidding about that. They sent it back to committee and it was dead. So I just wanted to jump in and say that before people start contacting you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for indulging my comments.
You're welcome. Representative Heiberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I'd like to thank all the conferees for being here today, and I really admire your service under the really difficult conditions you're working under. Nobody should be subjected to the kind of incidents that you described here. But I've been in the legislature for 8 years now. I've seen at least a dozen bills like this, and what I haven't seen in my recollection is any real evidence that a bill like this either deters the acts that are happening or reduces their number. I mean, several conferees stated that this bill is going to provide, increased protection for our healthcare workers. If I truly believe that, I'd support it in a heartbeat without any questions. But I guess what I haven't seen, like I said, I haven't seen the evidence. If you could provide anything like that to me, I'd be very grateful. So I could enthusiastically support this, but I'm going to have a hard time without that, despite how much I appreciate your hard work and service. If anybody has a question for anybody who wants to take it, if somebody like Ed has an answer, I'd be happy to hear it.
This is Kelly Summers from KSNA. If you had a question, I'd be happy to answer too on that.
Ed, why don't you go first?
Okay. I don't know if
Sorry.
I have I don't know if I have an answer, Representative Heiberger, because it's hard to provide data on the impact of something we can't get. So we don't know the impact that this will have. But we do know that there are some cases where we have asked for increased penalties that has produced results. And I'll share one with you real quickly. Many years ago, we were having a severe problem with serial shoplifters. And the problem was they'd go in and they'd do 20 shopliftings in a day or two, and everyone was a misdemeanor. And nothing was happening with them. And we asked for a bill that if they were engaged in 3 or more shopliftings within a certain time period, that it would become a felony regardless of the value. And we saw a drastic reduction in serial shoplifting. So sometimes these things do work, but we never know until we can have it in place and see what impact it has. And so it's a difficult question to answer. But I think part of the issue here is the public statement that would be made by passing this bill that this is serious, and it's serious enough that you all are willing to take that step. And we're not asking for it to be a felony from a misdemeanor. You know, we're just asking to step it up a little bit. Let's make a statement. And hopefully that will make a difference in at least some of the cases. That's the best I could do to answer that. Thank you.
Kelly, do you have anything additional to add?
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you. I was on a conversation this week with ANA and all of our constituent states. So we do have some that are in place that are tracking data, and I'm happy to see what I could find to provide that for you also. And I do believe part of our conversations have been too, when you brought that up, is that what are we going to do on top of having this type of bill in place, those preventative measures to even get to that point? And so I appreciate the question, because a bill in and of itself will not be the sole answer, but will be part of the answer on that too. So I think it's a really good question that you asked. So I appreciate it.
Representative Wheeler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to follow up with my fellow representative of thanking all of the conferees to be here today. Your testimony was most compelling. It's also, as I mentioned to my colleague to the left, very, very disturbing. And I had this question because I heard it several times. Do you really want to do this? Nothing will come of it anyway. I don't want you to be modest. I don't want you to be afraid. I would like anybody who has encountered that with regard to violence directed at you, who told you that? Was it staff in the hospital? Was it police officers? Or was it prosecutors? Who told you that? I would like to know.
I've dealt with multiple team members that have taken cases up against, crimes. And I've seen also most of them, if not all of them, have been dismissed out of court. So with that, it makes us lose trust in the legal system, truthfully. We don't feel that we have the community support. We don't feel that we're there and we're taken for granted at times. We are often the punching bags out there. So the thing is like I said, we have seen it firsthand where these cases are dismissed. Some of these people will be under the influence. Some of them will have some mental health concerns. The thing is also, though, is that people can get a DUI under the influence and they're still charged. How is it any different than to hit your nurse? How is it any different to cause great bodily harm like many of us have seen? So the thing is we have seen people take it to it, and it's not anything against our hospital administrators or staff. It's the leaders. It's actually when it actually goes to court. We have seen many of these cases dismissed.
Dismissed by the prosecutor or by the court?
I can't speak on the behalf of that, but I have seen it where they have went and represented them, and went to court and trial, and then they've had it not come out of anything.
Have you been to court?
I have not for this myself.
You know people who have been to court?
Yes.
And those people that you know that have been to court, was it dismissed by the prosecutor or was it dismissed because the court dismissed it? Do you know?
It would be probably the prosecutor, but I have to obtain more information for you. But they were wanting to fight it to the maximum. Because then it would be that we could get people to believe and trust in it. And like I said, it's kind of made a lot of them lose hope. It's like, why do it? Why waste our time if no one's going to stand with us?
Is there anybody else that would like to answer that question? May I, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Thank you for your question. Thank you, Chairman. One of the things was my case personally was dropped by the prosecutor, the DA of the county that I was in at the time. They didn't feel like that there was enough evidence to prove that there was anything to move forward on. We've also been told by multiple police officers that there's no point in doing it because there's nothing that's going to come of this. After we write this report, it's going to be let go by the prosecutor and it won't go forward.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Back to Representative Heiberger for a follow-up question that I missed a second ago.
No, I just want to note for the record and for the audience that the district attorney is an elected position.
Representative Samsel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A question for Valerie Gleason, if I could, please. I'm curious if she knows what happened with the man who brandished the gun under the existing law. What came of that? Was there assault, battery, any other types of charges, if she knows?
We do not know at this time.
Okay, thank you. One other question for Ed Klump very quickly, if I could, Mr. Chairman. It seems like I've heard that there's nothing happening with these misdemeanors, and yet we're hearing over and over today from our healthcare workers. Also heard quite a bit from educators yesterday with sports officials. But are there statistics on the charges and what comes of those, or something that we could see what's coming of these misdemeanor charges, how they're being handled? On the one hand, I share with some of my colleagues on my left, the need for something to change is certainly there. On the other side, is a bill like this, how much are we going to be able to affect the change that we're really seeking? Because at the end of the day, I hope we would all agree we don't want anybody treated like this, regardless of the setting.
The best data for that information would be from the courts. And as you know, the district courts are in the process of consolidating their state databases because right now they're scattered around through the court districts. And they are approaching finishing that project probably before too long. And in those district court cases, they would be able to look at that and tell you how many were filed and what the disposition, how many were disposed of by conviction, how many were disposed of by pleas, how many were dismissed. They would have all that information. As law enforcement, we don't keep disposition information. That's kept by the courts.
Okay, thank you, Ed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Owens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to follow up with Representative Heiberger that he's correct. The district attorneys are elected, but most municipal court, well, I don't know a single elected municipal court judge where the vast majority of these misdemeanors would be handled. We could take it to the next level and make it a shall arrest like we do DUIs and domestics, if that would get their attention. Thank you.
Any further questions for the proponents? Okay, I've already gone through no neutral or opponents here, so now I think I can close the hearing on House Bill 2620. Again, as everyone else did, thank you all for being here and sharing your stories with us. I anticipate this will be something we discuss in the coming days further, so we'll keep you all posted. Thank you. Committee, I have a long list of bills to work today, but I also have a parent-teacher conference for my daughter in 20 minutes, and she tells me what to do. So, yeah, we're not working bills today. Please, if you've not already done so, I know we had some confusion on the bus bill yesterday. Read through Natalie's bill brief on 2054. There was a lot of discussion we had yesterday that we were trying to remember things from 4 or 5 years worth of hearings, and we didn't get it right. So read the bill brief. Follow where the money comes in, how the contracts are established, how the review process works. It's not nearly as complicated as we were trying to make it yesterday. So read through that. Oh, and there is a sup note, so you can also click on that on the website and see, yeah, so check that out as well. And so I don't know when we'll work bills again. A revised agenda is going to come out tomorrow because things are kind of changing around, so we'll be in touch. Thank you all. Meeting's adjourned.